Goodbye.
For us, it was a ritual. Every Friday night, my friends, Liam, Chloe, Ben, and I would dive headfirst into the electric, grimy heart of Fairbanks, South Cushman Street. We were young, foolish, and fueled by a sense of invincibility that only comes from being in your early 20s. We loved the dive bars, the flickering neon signs that cut through the perpetual twilight of an Alaskan winter, and the low rumbling energy of a street that never truly slept. We knew its reputation. We'd heard the stories of deals gone wrong in dark corners, and the hushed warnings about certain establishments. But to us, that was part of the allure. We weren't looking for trouble, just a release from the monotonous cycle of work and study. We hopped from one dimly lit bar to another, our laughter echoing in the frosty air, feeling like we owned the night. We were masters of this small, chaotic universe, blissfully unaware that we were just tourists in a far more dangerous world, and that our weekly pilgrimage was leading us closer and closer to its terrifying core. We saw the shadows, but never believed they could ever reach out and touch us. That night started like any other. We were at the Howling Wolf, a place known more for its sticky floors and questionable clientele than its drinks. By 2 in the morning, we were feeling the familiar warm buzz of alcohol and camaraderie. We decided to call it a night, stepping out of the smoky bar and into the biting cold. Instead of waiting for a cab on Main Street, Liam suggested a shortcut through a back alley we'd used a dozen times before. It was a narrow, poorly lit passage that ran behind a row of pawn shops and boarded-up businesses. A thick layer of snow muffled our footsteps, creating an unsettling silence. We were halfway down the alley when a dark, windowless van that had been parked in the shadows suddenly roared to life, its headlights pinning us like startled deer. The side door slid open with a violent metallic screech, and 3 figures spilled out, their faces covered with dark bandanas. It happened so fast there was no time to scream, no time to run. A rough hand clamped over my mouth, the smell of gasoline and cheap tobacco filling my nostrils as I was dragged, kicking and struggling, into the suffocating darkness of the van. The world inside the van was a chaotic nightmare of tangled limbs, muffled cries, and the overwhelming stench of fear. I could feel Chloe sobbing somewhere beside me, and I could hear Ben grunting as he struggled against his captors. The van sped off, its tires squealing on the icy pavement, throwing us against the cold metal walls with every sharp turn. Rough zip ties were cinched painfully around our wrists. No one spoke to us. Our captors communicated in low, guttural grunts and sharp gestures, a language of pure menace. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional flash of a passing streetlight through a crack in the door, illuminating a terrifying tableau of our panicked faces. Those moments of transit felt like an eternity. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the senseless. Was this a robbery, a mistaken identity, or something far, far worse? The not knowing was a unique form of torture. A black void where my imagination conjured up every unspeakable horror imaginable. We had stepped off our well-trodden path for just a moment, and in that moment, the world had swallowed us whole. The van came to an abrupt stop, and we were hauled out into a grimy, single-car garage attached to a dilapidated house. The air was frigid and smelled of motor oil and decay. We were forced to our knees on the cold concrete floor, our heads pushed down. The leader, a man with cold, dead eyes and a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck, circled us like a shark. He pulled out Liam's wallet and began to read his driver's license aloud in a mocking tone. "Liam Peterson, student at UAF. What do you think, boys? We got ourselves some college kids." His voice was calm, almost bored, which made the situation 1,000 times more terrifying. They weren't angry or panicked. They were professionals. They methodically went through our pockets, taking our phones, wallets, and watches, tossing them into a grimy plastic bucket. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. One of them held a hunting knife to Ben's throat, the steel blade pressing just enough to make a point, hissing at him to stay still. We were completely at their mercy. 4 insignificant lives held in the hands of men who saw us not as people, but as a fleeting opportunity. The true terror wasn't the physical threat, it was the psychological game they played. The leader knelt in front of Chloe, who was shaking uncontrollably, and spoke in a soft, chilling whisper. "You know, we were just looking for a score," he said, his voice like gravel. "But you kids, you saw our faces." My blood ran cold. That was it. The unspoken line had been crossed. We were witnesses. He stood up and walked over to a workbench, picking up a heavy wrench and weighing it in his hand. My mind went blank with a white-hot, paralyzing fear. This was how it ended. A stupid shortcut, a final brutal moment in a filthy garage. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable. Just as the man with the wrench took a step toward Liam, a faint, distant sound pierced the thick silence. The rising wail of a police siren. It grew louder, closer, an impossible sound of salvation. The gang members froze, their aura of calm control instantly shattering into panicked confusion. One of them cursed, and then chaos erupted. The garage door was kicked in with a deafening crash, and the space was flooded with blinding white light and shouted commands of "APD, get on the ground." It was a scene of pure pandemonium. Our captors were tackled and subdued with brutal efficiency. Officers cut our zip ties, their hands firm but reassuring, wrapping us in emergency blankets and guiding us out of that house of horrors. The transition from certain death to sudden safety was so jarring it felt unreal. At the station, we gave our statements in a daze, our voices trembling. They told us a silent alarm at one of the pawn shops had been tripped when the van had screeched out of the alley, a 1 in a million chance that had saved our lives. They even recovered the bucket with all our belongings, a surreal anticlimax to the night's terror. We were the lucky ones, the anomaly in the grim statistics of South Cushman Street. We drove home in silence, the 4 of us huddled together in Ben's car. The familiar neon glow of South Cushman Street passed by the window, but it looked different now. The vibrant, exciting lights now seemed predatory and sinister, a garish mask hiding a deep and violent darkness. We had gone looking for a cheap thrill, and it stumbled into the abyss. We got everything back, our wallets, our phones, our lives. But we left something important behind in that cold, dirty garage, our naivety. We never went back to the Howling Wolf. For months, none of us could set foot in any bar after dark. The ritual was broken, shattered by the memory of a sliding van door and the cold, dead eyes of a man who saw us nothing more than a problem to be erased. The night no longer belonged to us. We knew now it never had.
When I first took the job at the 24-hour supply depot in Kenai, renting a small house right on the Kenai Spur Highway seemed like a stroke of genius. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., a vampire schedule that turned my days and nights upside down. The house was nothing special, a simple 2-bedroom rancher that was probably a fishing cabin in a past life, but it was a 5-minute drive from work. The convenience was undeniable. I told myself the constant rumble of trucks and the perpetual glow of headlights sweeping across my walls was a small price to pay for an easy commute. In my sleep-deprived state, I barely noticed the subtle undercurrent of decay in the area. The transient figures loitering near the gas stations, the overgrown yards of neighboring properties. I was just a ghost in my own life, sleeping while the world was awake and working while it slept. The house was just a place to crash, a shell to hold my exhausted body until my next shift. I never thought of it as a home, which, in retrospect, was a small mercy. You can't desecrate a place that was never sacred to begin with. The trouble started subtly, like a slow-leaking faucet you ignore until the floor is flooded. Little things would go missing from the yard. A set of snow tires I had stacked by the shed vanished one week. A week later, my gas grill was gone. I filed a police report over the phone, and the dispatcher sounded as tired and uninterested as I felt. "Things tend to walk away on the spur," she said with a sigh. "Keep your stuff locked up." I'd bought a heavy chain and a padlock for the shed and installed a motion sensor light over the back door. I felt a small, foolish sense of accomplishment, as if I had outsmarted the nebulous threat that lurked in the periphery. But the intrusions didn't stop. They just moved closer. One morning, I came home to find a long, clean slit in my bedroom window screen. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed inside. It was just a silent, unnerving message: we can get closer whenever we want. I started sleeping with a baseball bat by my bed, the weight of it a cold and inadequate comfort against the growing dread. The day it happened, I was coming off a particularly brutal shift. A blizzard had rolled in off the Cook Inlet, and we'd spent 8 hours loading salt and sand trucks. I was bone-tired, my mind a foggy landscape of exhaustion. All I wanted was to collapse onto my couch and drift into unconsciousness. I pulled into my driveway, the snow crunching under my tires, then trudged to the front door. The lock turned too easily. It wasn't broken, just unlocked. A sliver of ice-cold adrenaline cut through my fatigue. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, and my brain simply stopped working. The living room was gone. I don't mean it was trashed or in disarray. I mean it was empty. My worn-out leather couch, the coffee table covered in old magazines, the tall bookshelf filled with paperbacks, the large flat-screen television I'd spent my first paycheck on, all of it had vanished into thin air. The only things left were the faint indentations in the carpet where the furniture used to be, like the ghostly footprints of a life that had been erased. I stood there in the doorway for what felt like an hour, my mind refusing to process the scene. It was the sheer impossibility of it that was so terrifying. There were no signs of forced entry, no drag marks on the floor, no stray debris. The room was immaculately, surgically empty. It was as if a team of malevolent movers had teleported my entire living room to another dimension. My heart began to pound, a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. With a sense of creeping horror, I forced myself to move, my boots feeling heavy as lead. I checked the rest of the house. The kitchen was untouched. My half-eaten bowl of cereal was still on the counter. My bedroom was exactly as I had left it that morning. My bed unmade, my clothes in a heap on a chair. They had taken only the living room. The selectivity of the act was what tipped it from a simple robbery into the realm of the truly nightmarish. This wasn't random. It was a statement. It felt deeply, intimately personal. The police officer who responded was a young, fresh-faced kid who looked as bewildered as I felt. He walked through the empty space, his flashlight beam dancing across the bare walls, a frown creasing his brow. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, shaking his head. "It's too clean. To get a couch and a bookshelf out of here without leaving a single mark, they knew what they were doing. A whole crew, probably." He asked the usual questions. Did I have any enemies? Was I involved in anything shady? The questions themselves felt like an accusation, as if I had somehow invited this surreal violation into my life. He took my statement, but we both knew it was a pointless exercise. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no leads. They were ghosts, just like the officer in Anchorage had said. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I couldn't. I sat on the cold floor of my empty living room, the baseball bat held tightly in my hands, and stared at the bare walls, listening. Every gust of wind, every passing truck on the highway was the sound of them coming back to finish the job. I couldn't stay. The house was no longer just a shell. It was a monument to my own vulnerability. The empty room was a constant, screaming reminder of how easily my world could be dismantled. Every time I walked past it, a cold dread would wash over me. It felt like a part of my own mind had been scooped out, leaving a hollow, vacant space. I started to feel watched, even at work. I saw suspicion in every shadow, a threat in every stranger's gaze. Were they watching me right now? Did they know my schedule? Why just the living room? Was it a warning? Was the next room to be my bedroom while I was sleeping in it? The questions spiraled in my head, a vortex of paranoia from which there was no escape. The convenience of living on the Kenai Spur Highway had become a curse, a direct line for the darkness to find its way to my door. Within a week, I had packed my remaining belongings into a U-Haul. I broke my lease, not caring about the financial penalty. My landlord didn't seem surprised. As I drove away, I took one last look at the small, unassuming house in my rearview mirror. It looked perfectly normal from the outside, just another building swallowed by the vast and different landscape of the highway. But I knew what was inside. I knew about the perfectly empty room, a vacuum that had sucked all the security out of my life. They never caught who did it, and I never got my things back. But I know now that they took far more than just furniture. They took my very ability to ever feel truly safe behind a locked door. They stole the very concept of sanctuary, leaving me with the chilling knowledge that sometimes the monsters don't just break in. Sometimes they simply erase you, one room at a time.
My escape to Anchorage was supposed to be a baptism by ice, a cleansing of the 15 years I'd wasted on a man who left me for someone younger in the relentless sunshine of San Diego. I traded sandy beaches for snow-capped mountains, the familiar hum of the I-5 for the eerie quiet of a northern city. I found a small apartment in a historic building downtown, something with character and a view of the Chugach Mountains that seemed to promise a stoic, unyielding strength I hoped to absorb. The first few weeks were a dream of reinvention. I explored the coastal trail, felt the sting of clean, cold air on my cheeks, and believed I was finally building a life on my own terms. The city had a raw, untamed edge that felt exciting, a stark contrast to the polished, predictable life I'd left behind. I was naive. I mistook the city's sharp edges for character, when in reality they were just teeth waiting for an opportunity to bite down hard. That initial sense of freedom was a mirage, a beautiful and deadly illusion shimmering over a landscape of profound indifference and hidden dangers that I was completely unprepared for. The mountains I admired from my window were not guardians. They were silent, impassive witnesses to the ugliness that festered in the streets below. The first bite came on a Tuesday evening, just as the winter sun was surrendering to an oppressive, inky twilight. I was walking back from a small grocery store, my arms laden with provisions for a quiet night in, when a shadow detached itself from a darkened alleyway. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouted demands. It was terrifyingly simple. A man, his face obscured by a hooded sweatshirt and the deepening gloom, simply stepped into my path and held out a hand. He didn't speak a word. His silence was more menacing than any threat could have been. In his other hand, he held something that glinted faintly under the distant streetlight, a small, wicked-looking knife. My breath caught in my throat, a frozen knot of pure terror. I dropped my groceries, the sound of a glass jar shattering on the pavement echoing the shattering of my newfound security. He took my purse and vanished back into the shadows as quickly as he had appeared, leaving me trembling and alone on the cold sidewalk, surrounded by the ruins of my dinner. It was over in less than 30 seconds, but it left a permanent scar on my perception of the city. My safe haven had been breached, not in my home, but within my own sense of self. The streets I had walked with hopeful curiosity now felt like a predator's hunting ground, and I was just another piece of prey. The first time my apartment was broken into, it felt less like a robbery than more like a personal violation, a deliberate defilement of my sanctuary. I came home from work to find my front door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness that screamed wrongness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pushed it open. They hadn't taken much: a laptop from the kitchen counter, some spare cash I'd foolishly left in a drawer. But what they left behind was far worse. A single, muddy boot print was stamped onto the center of my living room rug, a filthy emblem of their intrusion. The window in the small spare bedroom had its latch broken, a gaping wound in the side of my home. The police were polite but procedural, their questions clinical and their expressions conveying a tired resignation. They took my statement, dusted for fingerprints they likely knew they'd never match, and gave me a case number that felt like a ticket to a bureaucratic void. "It happens a lot in this area," the older officer said, his voice devoid of any real sympathy. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak of the old building, every distant siren was the sound of them coming back for more. The ghost of their presence lingered in the air, a cold spot in the heart of my home. The second break-in happened 2 months later, and this time it was bolder. I had installed new locks and a cheap security bar for the door, foolishly believing these measures would be a deterrent. I was wrong. They simply smashed the same window they had broken the latch on before, a contemptuous act that showed how little they cared for my feeble attempts at security. This time they took more. My television was gone, along with a box of jewelry that contained the last few keepsakes I had from my mother. It was a targeted, efficient plundering. When the police arrived, it was almost a carbon copy of the first visit. The same questions, the same notes scribbled in a pad, the same hollow promise to look into it. This time, however, a younger officer offered a piece of advice. "Honestly, ma'am," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "these guys are ghosts. They hit a place and melt away. They know we're stretched thin. You might want to consider a different neighborhood." His words, meant to be helpful, felt like a confirmation of my deepest fear. I was on my own. The system designed to protect me was powerless, and the invaders who had breached my home were free to return whenever they pleased. The third time was the one that finally broke me. It happened just a week after the second. They didn't even bother breaking the window this time. They simply kicked the door in, splintering the frame and shattering the illusion that I had any control over my own life. When I walked in and saw the gaping hole where my door used to be, a wave of nausea and despair washed over me. I slowly walked through the apartment, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. They had taken almost nothing of value. Instead, they had engaged in a campaign of psychological warfare. They had opened my fridge and thrown eggs all over the kitchen floor. They had taken the photos of my family off the mantelpieces and arranged them in a circle on my bed, facing inwards. It was a message. It wasn't about my belongings anymore. It was about me. They were showing me that they could get to me whenever they wanted, that they could touch the most intimate parts of my life. The police call was a mere formality this time. I didn't even have the energy to feel angry. I just felt a profound, soul-crushing emptiness. This wasn't a home. It was a stage for my recurring violation. That night, I sat on the floor of my desecrated living room, staring at the shattered doorframe. The majestic view of the mountains from my window now seemed to mock me, their silent peaks a testament to a wildness I could never tame, both outside and in the heart of the city. The dream of a new life in Anchorage had died. It had been murdered by a series of quiet, anonymous intrusions that had systematically dismantled my sense of safety and sanity. There was no single monster to fight, no clear villain to blame. There was only the gnawing, ambient terror of a place where you could be targeted for no reason at all, and where no one could help you.
The city's teeth had finally closed, and I knew I had to get out before they stripped me down to the bone. I was done trying to be strong, done trying to build something new on such rotten ground. My resilience had been exhausted, replaced by a desperate primal need to simply be safe again. The cold, it turned out, wasn't just in the air. It was in the very soul of the place. I packed what little I had left into my car the very next day. I didn't even bother to properly fix the door. I just pushed a heavy bookshelf in front of it and left the keys on the counter for my landlord. I drove south without looking back, the jagged peaks of the Chugach Range shrinking in my rearview mirror. Every mile I put between myself and Anchorage felt like a pound of weight being lifted from my chest. I didn't stop until I saw the familiar, comforting glow of city lights that didn't feel threatening. I returned to San Diego, to the sunshine I had once so desperately tried to escape. I moved into a small, unglamorous apartment in a boring suburb, far from the ocean and any semblance of excitement. My friends called it a retreat, a failure, but they didn't understand. I wasn't running from a failed relationship anymore. I was running from the ghosts of downtown Anchorage, from the memory of a muddy boot print, and from the chilling realization that the most terrifying monsters are the ones you can't see, the ones who can walk into your home and take everything without ever showing their face.